Welcome back to Star Wars News Net. My name is Tyler, joined by Tom, and we have a special guest today. Doctor, best-selling author, producer, singer-songwriter, filmmaker, screenwriter, I'm sure, parent, loving husband, all of the accolades that you could think of. Anything, any title out there, our guest probably has achieved or done at some time in his life. We have Dr. James Kahn on with us today to talk about his upcoming memoir, coming out very soon, my Jedi Memoir, Double Life. And James, thank you for joining us today. We are absolutely thrilled to dive into the memoir, other stories that we can get into from the book. But it's an honor to have you on today. Thank you so much. We're
My
really
pleasure.
excited
Thanks
to
for
get
having
going.
me. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. So a couple of things before we dive into the meat and potatoes of this. So I was speaking with Tom before, and the book, to me, one of the more fascinating aspects of it was that it felt like you could have had three entire memoirs just out of this one book, or it could have been three times as long with as many stories that maybe you didn't elaborate on as much as you would have liked, or you
Yeah.
said, oh, that's a story for another day. So I'm curious, what was the process like, even of deciding I'm going to maybe tell this story from the ER and tie it and have a parallel with what was going on in my life at the time, or diving into some of these life experiences a little bit more?
Right. Yeah, that's definitely true. And it's even true that after I turned it in and it had gone to galleys and it was all done and I couldn't do anything more, I continued thinking of all these stories I wish I had added and one story would lead to
Mhm.
another. Um, the process of what got me started writing it was kind of multifocal. It started out with my kids wanting me to write a memoir because I had,
Mm.
told these stories all my life to them at the dinner table, and they got excited about it, and they said, "Oh, these stories shouldn't die with you. Everyone should hear about those." And I felt
Mhm.
like there was a certain amount of hubris attached to it at first. Like, why would anybody be interested in my little stories?
Right.
But once I got into it, it was kind of fun writing them. And I always remembered, I have some stories, mostly oral histories from my grandparents about their flight from Russia at the turn of the century, and I loved reading them. I thought, well, and great grandchildren certainly will never get to know me. Get to know me a little bit by reading these stories.
Mm.
So that was one aspect of it. This came from all the Comic-Con sites I've gone to for Return of the Jedi over the years, and all
Mhm.
the people who had come to get books signed who would tell me, they learned how to read on my book, and they read the cover until the pages fell out, and it was such an important part of their lives. And I thought it would be nice for them, sort of a big Easter egg for all those fans, to really dive into the writing of the book itself and
Mhm.
describe what my thought processes were about writing individual sections. And then that made me think of there's a book, an autobiography by William Goldman called Adventures in the Screen Trade. He was a novelist and screenwriter. He wrote Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Marathon Man and Princess Bride. And he wrote an autobiography of his years in Hollywood. And one of the things he did in it was to reprint the entire script of Butch Cassidy, Sundance Kid, and then have a section going over, well, I liked what I did here. I would not do this again. I thought this part stunk. And it was a real nice look at how to use something. So I wanted to do that with it as well.
Mhm. Absolutely. I love the way you mentioned that at the end of the book, that it was really like your kids, your grandkids that were some of the primary influences to get you started.
Yeah.
And I know that you can relate to that a little bit more, like having like kids yourself, but
Yeah.
it's fascinating too to think about how your journey, started so long before you had all these kids, and then they're hearing this secondhand. I would
Yeah.
love to even know someday what their thoughts are when they end up reading the book. I'm sure you've
Yes.
showed them little things. Are there
Yeah.
stories in there that maybe they haven't read yet, or
I think
they're
probably.
going to
I
be
think they.
surprised to see?
Yeah, probably. I can't remember which ones anymore. I told so many of them so many times that, it is in the fire. I'm sure they know at least half the stories in there that I've told
Mhm.
before, but some of them will certainly come as a surprise. them came as a surprise to me as I was writing. I would be
Mhm.
writing one section about something that happened in Hollywood, and that would remind me of something that happened in the hospital. So I would write that, and the two lives kept bouncing off each other as I wrote.
Mhm.
I love the title of the memoir, Double Life. And I
Yeah,
feel like, as a creative person myself, I feel like a lot of creative people kind of face that in their experience and on their journey, as far as, finding a career that's going to sustain them and that they can pay their bills and pay the rent and everything, but still hold on to the creative aspect of their life. It keeps driving them to
very,
write that book, write that song.
yeah, very
So,
much.
one of the anecdotes I love is when you open the book. I don't want to give too much away, but how you got involved with Steven Spielberg and how it started your novelization career. And if
Yeah,
you want to touch on that a bit.
I mean to tell that, sure. That was people asked me how I got into Hollywood, and I said by going to medical school. Um, I was working in the ER at St. John's Hospital in Santa Monica. We got a call one day from a woman asking if anybody down there could help her figure out how to resuscitate an alien. So turned out it was Kathleen Kennedy, and she came down to the ER with Melissa Matheson, who wrote ET. They were filming ET at the time, and we gave them a demonstration of how we would do it, and they liked what they saw. They hired us. I mean, they didn't hire us. We didn't get any money for it, but they brought us down to the set at the M Studios, and Stephen wanted to populate that resuscitation scene with all medical emergency professionals just doing what we ordinarily do to give it a sense of reality. So he dressed us all up in hazmat suits and told us just to pretend this little pop line on the gurney was someone who was having a cardiac arrest, and go through all the things we would do, shout what we would shout, and start IV lines, and we all got to pump on his chest, and so that was my introduction to Hollywood. While I was there, I had by this time just published my first actual sci-fi novel called World Enough and Time by Del Rey. So I got up all my nerve one after the first day between setups, and I went up to him with my book and I said, Spielberg, I know people must come to you and ask this all the time, but I wonder if you would consider reading my book sometime and maybe even making a movie out of it. So he was very gracious and said, sure, I'll take it and put it on my bookshelf, and if I can get to it sometime. So, you know, that was as much as I wanted, really, for him to acknowledge that
Mhm.
I had written something and see my face. But the next day, he called me into his office and said he had read a little bit of it, and he gave it to Frank Marshall, who was producing ET. Um, Frank, they were all very young people. Frank and Stephen and Kathleen and Melissa. It was kind of like a college kind of vibe about the whole thing.
Mm.
Were they married at the time, Frank and
Frank
Kathy?
and Kathleen were married at the time, and Melissa was married to Harrison Ford at the time, Melissa Matheson.
Right.
And so it was like a community of kids, just hey, let's get together and make a movie.
Mhm.
So he called me into his office and he said, well, we read a little bit of your book and liked it, and we're kind of behind the eight ball on the Poltergeist novelization, the draft we have. So if you can promise to give us the whole book in a month, you got the gig. So I said, deal. And that was how I got started in Hollywood.
Mm. And you kind of tie this into a lot of the novel, which is about tying it into what a real like sci-fi or a real hero's journey is in movies throughout, your book, where and you kind of drew parallels from some of your experiences. And the thing that really resonates with me that you talked about was like the hesitation to
Yeah,
answer the call to action. And then
yeah,
this was your moment where you hesitated for a moment and thought, started thinking about all the things that maybe you would prevent you from doing this, but then you decide, I'm taking the call. I'm going into battle
right,
here. I'm
right.
going to do this.
That's such a characteristic part of the hero's journey.
Mhm.
And I actually, funnily enough, I rewatched the first half hour of episode 4, A New Hope of Star Wars last night. My wife and I have been binging on the second season of Andor, and that
Oh, yeah.
took us right into Rogue One, and that got us to the beginning of A New Hope, then to see them all connect. And there's this, the moment where Obi-Wan Kenobi says, you got to come join the rebellion. And Luke
Mhm.
says, I can't. I gotta go put in the crops, and
Mhm.
Aunt Beru and Uncle Owen need me. there's all these reasons why he can't go on this hero's journey until something happens to make him turn around. So yeah, so that happened to me in that moment too. But
Mhm.
he offered me the job, and I had this long internal dialogue about, well, I can't do that. And I have some
Oh no.
bail out on my shifts, and then I thought, well, maybe I can get someone to work my shifts for me, and then
Right.
but so many of them, and went back and forth and back and forth, and finally I just jumped in.
So it's funny you mentioned like the Andor Rogue One. Tom and I were just talking before about, have you watched Rogue One since you finished season 2 of Andor? I feel like so many people, and then I even mentioned I might just have to watch episode 4 tonight after I
Yeah,
finished Rogue One yesterday. So
exactly,
it's funny.
exactly.
It's the Star Wars community going on the same journey
Yeah.
across the globe. So
Episode
I know
4 looks
Tom.
so. Episode 4, I found, I loved it, of course, but
Mhm,
after Rogue One, it looks so simple, and I want to say
mhm.
not a cartoonish exactly, but it's so lighthearted, and it is like a kids movie, and the others are really grown-up movies.
So part of the hero's journey, answering the call, and there's another part of that which you mentioned, in your story, which is there's going to be a moment where the hero is in some sort of a crisis or is facing a moment where they're trying to figure out, what's the next step for me. And Tom has a lot of more insight maybe on what the Return of the Jedi novelization was like, but something you wrote in your memoir that really stuck out with me was, you said, and I wrote it down, that writing Return of the Jedi novelization really solidified humanity back into your soul. And it just feels like this was perfectly timed with some of the themes that we see in Return of the Jedi, specifically with, Anakin coming back and Luke being, devoid of some level of hope at times, but still clinging on to the idea that he can like bring his father back, or, being worried
Uh,
about the rebellion. And I just would love to know even a little bit more. You talked about your time with the ER. I would love for the audience to kind of know how those two lives that you were living and kind of the mask that you talk about wearing, how was that affecting all the things going into where Return of the Jedi was that moment where you felt that humanity coming back into your
yeah,
soul.
yeah. Uh, the One of the big emotional motivations taking me into emergency medicine was a desire from a very early age to be a sorcerer, a wizard. The idea that I could, be in an emergency room where people could get brought in dead, and I could bring them back to life,
Mm,
was like a very powerful mythos for me to follow. There are lots of other reasons to helping people, and lots of reasons to be a doctor, but to be that specific kind of doctor was tied to my early childhood days reading amazing stories and lots of comic books about
mhm,
wizards.
It's like
Um,
having a superpower.
it's like having a superpower. Exactly. That's exactly what it's like. And that's what working in the emergency room felt like at first. It was a remarkable experience having these critically ill and injured people come in,
mm,
and with my hands and mind, bring them back. It was really exciting and gratifying. Um, but as the years went by, I think especially our doctors, we have to put up emotional barriers in order to do the uh, just witnessing the horror that people do to each other and to themselves.
mhm,
It makes you, as a doctor, can make you cynical, can make you sarcastic about their pain. After a while, it begins to distance you from your own humanity. And I was
mm,
starting, there's a higher burnout rate among ER docs than anybody else. So I was starting to experience that. Um,
mhm,
Meanwhile, writing had always been my first love, and it connected me to a very human aspect of myself. I can get into the humanity of my characters and tie them to my own.
mhm,
Uh, and so after this big success with Jedi, not only the tropes of the story itself, um, but the hearts of the people who are the characters in the book, I felt like brought me back into my own humanity. And after that, the more time I spent writing scripts and novels, and in that world, and talking to writers, and talking philosophy and psychology, and love and hope, made me a better person. And the longer I stayed in the ER, the more hardened and cynical I became.
Right.
So it was nice to balance them both, because I did
Mhm.
like going back to the ER periodically. It was
Mhm.
exciting, and but just not as much as I do. I mean, I was really fortunate that I had a day job like that, like working as a doctor, that it could support me during the dry times of being a writer.
Mm. It's interesting you mentioned the high burnout of like ER doctors. As so I'm a public school teacher, and I see some of similar things in the workplace where people come and go so quickly, or you're just watching the life kind of get zapped out. They start off
Yeah,
really optimistic
yeah,
maybe, and then at the end of the year they're very jaded or very frustrated, and you have to find that outlet or that other thing that brings that life back inside of you. And I think it's incredible that Star Wars was able to do that for you. But
yeah,
then I imagine, and this is where I'm going to pivot to Tom, but I imagine that the novelization of Return of the Jedi did that for many people
yeah.
because of just the inability to go see the movie more than a handful of times, given we weren't in the day. Like, I grew up in this era of streaming and all of these things, but
Right,
that didn't
exactly.
exist in the 80s.
Yeah, fans told me that, as I said, over the years when I would go to Comic Cons, that back then there weren't even DVDs or VCRs
Mhm.
originally. It was like the only way you could re-experience it after you saw it once or twice in its first release in the theater was to read the novelization over and over.
Mhm.
I remember being having the novel and just I took it everywhere. I was 11 years old. I was reading it. And I remember going to a family event, and I was getting up to the good part when Obi-Wan, I'm sure you heard this a lot at Comic Cons, when he was describing what happened to Anakin in the lava.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
that
yeah.
was mind blowing for us. As you said, being a kid at that time, there weren't DVD extras. You couldn't
Right.
find stuff on YouTube, and a lot of information wasn't really privy to us. And the movie was out in the theater, and then it was gone for a while until maybe
Yeah.
it made it onto
Mhm.
home video.
Right.
So, and to get all that information, I remember one thing, and a lot of the lines when I was reading your memoir, a lot of the lines stuck out to me. I still remember them when
Really.
3PO said that he was wished he could close his eyes.
Yeah.
That still, I remember reading that in the book, and I remember so clearly about uh, Obi-Wan saying to Luke that when Anakin came out of the lava, he was irredeemable. I think it was irredeemably dark, and that just always stuck with me. And it helped me enjoy the movie even more, because
Yeah.
when you think about it, Yoda and Obi-Wan really gave up on Anakin, but Luke
Right.
never did. So, but that was just so amazing. It just like it really started my mind just thinking about I wonder what that was like. And seeing that, I guess, battle that we ultimately saw in episode 3 many years later,
Right.
just
Right.
playing that out in my head. So it was definitely a thrill to read the novel. And question for you, how did it feel to get an early, I guess, version of the script before anyone else had seen it, to know the
Yeah. Oh, it
story?
was so unbelievably exciting. I was a huge Star Wars fan for the first two movies, and never occurred to me I would ever get involved in it. And y- it was just fortuitous that I had just finished doing the Poltergeist novelization when Lucas was looking for someone to novelize Jedi, and he asked Spielberg for a recommendation, and Spielberg had loved the Poltergeist novelization, so I got picked. And I was like stunned. I can remember so clearly feeling like, what? I get to see this first, and then not being able to share it with anybody. I didn't even tell my wife what the story was, and of course, I was all under all kinds of NDAs, but it was clear that it was a special honor I was being given.
And I think the courage that you had with Spielberg to actually give him your novel. And also, I was thinking about the courage that you had to even suggest changes to the end of Return of the Jedi was very
Yeah,
interesting.
yeah, courage or stupidity. I don't know which. I felt as I was doing it, I was feeling like, what the hell am I doing? You know, approaching George Lucas in the waning days of shooting this wonderful movie, me telling him how to end it. It's like, come on. But you know, again, like with Spielberg, I thought, well, I'm never, ever, ever in my life going to have this chance again. And the worst that can happen is he'll look at me and roll his eyes, you know.
That's incredible. So, one thing that I've always wondered in Return of the Jedi, and then when I was reading through your book, and you mentioned, you have lots of different pieces from the novelization of Return, and there's a great Leia moment that really stuck out to me that I had forgotten about from the novelizations. I've read it many years ago. I've read every novelization for the Star Wars movies. It's just something I love to do. And Tom knows, major book nerd here, but I always felt in the movie that Leia never had her like signature moments, maybe necessarily in the movie. There's a lot of great Leia scenes, but I feel like Han in some regard has a moment, Luke has his moment, but
Yeah,
when
yeah,
you wrote in the book about how Leia was ultimately the one to convince the Ewoks to join the fight with the rebellion, and in
right.
many ways she saves the rebellion in that moment,
Yeah.
and where did that maybe come from? Was it out of a desire to give Leia maybe another big moment in the book that didn't make
It
its way
was.
in the movie?
I felt like Leia got kind of short shrift in a number of ways in the movie, and I wanted to give something to her. I can't remember if I mentioned this in the book or not, but I had written a whole section just about her, giving her backstory growing up on Alderaan. Um,
Hmm.
and that was taken out of the novelization, was edited out because it didn't fit in with his vision, Lucas's vision of what her backstory actually was, which is fair. But I was looking for ways to give at least small
Hmm.
pieces to her. So that was one that I did, was try to elevate her a little bit in importance in convincing the Ewoks.
Hmm. No,
I
the
also
the line.
had
You on.
there's also a section that also got edited out of the book of her memories of being tortured by Vader and
Hmm.
his torture droid in episode 4.
Hmm.
That was cut out. I wasn't told why, but I assume because it was too creepy. I think, thinking
Hmm.
that he was her father doing this to her.
Hmm. It's interesting that you mentioned that particular scene because there are a few Star Wars works that happened since. Like there's a book called Bloodline from Claudia Gray that gets into a little bit of the torture that she experienced
Oh,
and how she never was able to see the good in Vader and see Anakin as her father like Luke was able to do because of that.
yeah,
And so part of me wonders if that was as that book was being written. That'd be a great question for Claudia Gray, even if
yeah,
some of those like things were told to her at some point of like this is a big part of Leia that we need to explore that maybe we weren't able to in the past. So I don't know.
right.
That might be
It's an
curious
interesting
to.
idea. Yeah, yeah.
And you had a few alternate things that you were playing around with, which was some of them were Obi-Wan and Uncle Owen being these brothers that
Brothers. Yeah, that was
they're
a
split
whole little
up at time.
backstory that I invented that I'm glad made it through. But it was always sort of curious, like why was Owen so pissed off at Obi-Wan? What's the deal with their relationship? What happened to make them? So I invented this whole little backstory because it felt like a way that older brothers who went through a lot of bad times together as kids might act towards each other. So,
Hmm.
so I invented this thing in which they were brothers, and Obi-Wan was the older brother, and their father wanted him to take over the farm, but Obi-Wan wanted to go and be a Jedi Knight, and so was banished from the family, and then finally, after not coming back for years and leaving very acrimoniously, next time he shows up, he has this little infant Luke with
Hmm.
him and asks Owen and Beru to adopt him, and Owen doesn't want to at first because he's still really angry.
Hmm.
He blames Obi-Wan for their father's death, basically of a broken heart. Yes. But Beru wants to adopt Luke because they don't have children of their own. So I made that all up, and they left it in. I guess they liked it.
That's great. So I actually at this time, after you wrote the novelization, I know you wrote a few other ones. You wrote Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom
Right.
and a few others, and then you segued into television writing.
I did. I was let's see at what point. It was after the Indiana Jones novelization.
Mhm.
Um, I had written a spec script based on my experiences in the ER called Code Blues
Mhm.
that nobody bought as a movie, but it got me a lot of meetings. People liked the writing, and it got me a job finally as a head writer on a what's called a strip show, which is 5 nights a week, 30-minute, 5 nights a week show. It was supposed to run against Johnny Carson at night. And it was during that phase that I got offered the next Indiana Jones novelization, which was The Last Crusade, I think. And I had to turn that down because I was just too busy. Um, but turning that down was the thing that sort of shut me out after that from the novelization racket.
Mhm.
And I committed to television at that point. So I did all of my pitching and trying to get work in TV. My agent at the time told me that it takes 6 to 8 years for a movie scriptwriter to see their work go from the written page to on the screen if they're lucky.
Right.
Um, but so writing movies is a hobby, but writing television is a career. You can just get jobs over and over every season. So that's the direction I went.
One question I did have is how, and I don't know if I'm getting ahead of myself, but how do you see the landscape now for writers as far as not just novelizations, but also for TV and film? Do you think that still holds true as far as TV being a good, with all the streaming, I guess, networks
I
now?
think it
Or
is.
is it
It's a very different landscape. I mean, it used to be, all under the control of three networks and one independent system, and everything was very highly structured. Writers would get hired in the spring, and they'd start writing the series over the course of the summer, and would go into production at the end of the summer, and would start getting broadcast in the fall, and that's how every show on television went. And now there are just so many shows streaming, being produced in other countries all through the year. There's no season to it. So there are opportunities galore for writers. On the other hand, the pay is not nearly as good as it was in a lot of these cases. And now series are ordered for 6 or 8 shows mostly. When I wrote Melrose Place, we were doing 34 shows a year.
Mhm.
And then Star Trek was, I think, 26.
Mhm. So
wow.
you juxtapose a lot of your life with experiences in the ER, times writing, from your transitions from being a novelization writer to getting into TV writing to becoming a parent to all of these lives that you started in Hollywood. But you kind of juxtapose a lot with these ER experiences. But there's one person in particular that you really laid out his whole story that you had with him in the hospital, and that was
Yeah,
Leo that you mentioned
right,
in the book,
right.
and that captivated me on many levels, just both as someone interested in reading about your life and work, but just as a human being that got to kind of see behind the curtain of what happens in a hospital or having these real human conversations that
Yeah,
are
yeah.
probably difficult to recount. What about Leo was like the reason why he was the one that you wanted to use is like kind of like a going a back and forth point here from
Right.
the ER to Hollywood.
For, for one thing, Leo was a patient during my internship, and it was a medical internship. Wasn't in the emergency room. Uh,
Okay.
so so
Right.
it was I was an intern on the internal medicine floors. We have patients come in and stay for lengths of time, and he was in long enough because he was so sick and had so
Mhm.
many different things going wrong, all stemming from his diabetes, basically,
Mhm.
that we got to be friends. Um, you know, generally, it's not a good idea to become friends with your patients. It distorts your objectivity in terms of deciding how to help them best,
Mhm.
and it's not good for them or you psychologically if things go bad. Um,
Mhm.
so, but for whatever reasons, we became friends, and he was under my care for weeks going in and out of various kinds of emergencies. You know,
Mhm.
he'd go into heart failure and we'd get him out. He'd go into high blood pressure and we'd get him out. He'd go into kidney failure and we'd get him out. So it was a long stretch of trying to save his life over and over. Um, and he and I, in parallel, gradually realizing this was the end. There was no
Mhm.
reason to keep going through these heroics that were just kind of torturing him for a temporarily
Mhm.
saving his life, until we both finally at the end came to the understanding that it was time to let him go.
Mhm.
And then part of my job was to fight my resident who wanted to go through yet one more episode
Mhm.
of saving him. So that was a big
I
turning point for me.
I think I read that particular moment 3 or 4 times. Like, I went back and read through that again when you had that, like, last conversation that you had with him, and then when the resident was wanting to continue on, and you mentioned, like, literal like, a physical altercation
The
that you
physical
had.
fight, yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
I can remember still the feeling. I was like shaking. I was so upset and
Mhm.
angry. And
Mhm.
he was just kind of
No.
a martinet. It was just, you do things by the rules. This person's oxygen is low. You got to intubate them.
Mhm. And you mentioned your wife, jailed so many times throughout this book and I think some of the words that you used often were, like strength, patience, encouraging. Like, there were so many of those, like, 3 words I feel like I saw multiple times. What could you talk about her for me? I would love to know a little bit more about her, and then I can't
Yeah, yeah,
imagine you
yeah.
guys' lives are so fascinating, jumping from Hollywood to moving up in your, more rural area to you're
Right,
working
right.
all these different walks of life.
Yeah, yeah. She's been a great source of nurturing for me. She's an artist. She's a great artist. She was initially a collage artist, but then for many years, a book and paper artist. She would make her own paper, make paper pulp, and then you smash it together in these hydraulic presses, and then put it together in handmade artists' books. But she has always been my first and biggest champion to pursue my art rather than my medicine. She
Hmm.
wasn't like a traditional doctor's wife who was there, kind of along for the ride to get all the goodies and perks of an expensive lifestyle. Uh, if I had just been a doctor all these years, I'd be much more wealthy than I am now. Um,
Mhm.
but at every turn, she would encourage me to make the choice of following my art. And those particular stories, some of them that I told about deaths in the emergency room, when I first did my ER residency at LA
Mhm.
County, I would come back at the end of a shift and just start unloading all these things that I had seen in the ER on her. And that was okay for a while, but finally she said, stop. I can't deal with this.
Mhm.
Why don't you write them all down? Uh,
Mm,
so I wrote out, one-page scenarios every time I witnessed or participated in a death in the ER. And our plan was for her to illustrate each one and then privately publish a book called The Death Cantos, um,
wow.
which we still have never done, and it's still on the back burner. But in the meantime, I took a few of the stories out and put them in the memoir.
Absolutely.
That's amazing to have support because as a creative person, it's so important to have that support from a partner
Yeah, yeah,
because it can easily if it's not there or it's tough because what we do is at creatively I have creative projects on the side and sometimes it's a little bit crazy to talk about what we're doing or what we want to do
yeah,
and have someone to be there and actually trust you
yeah.
and be there with you through it.
No, I
That's
know
that's really wonderful.
it's phenomenal, and it's also, the other part of being a creative is being a freelancer of any kind is you have successes and failures and you have downtimes. And in TV writing, that's what residuals are for. You write something
Mhm.
and you get residuals during the downtimes when you're not being hired to do
Mhm.
anything. But it can be very psychologically debilitating to be writing and putting yourself out there and no one's buying anything, and it's rejection. People think, oh, wrote the Return of the Jedi, you must be this fantastic successful person. Well, sometimes I am and sometimes I'm not, and sometimes years go by without getting any traction. And during all that time, Jill's position was always, keep pursuing your art.
Mm-hmm. There was during one of those, like, I guess, dry seasons that you mentioned, where I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, it was her that maybe suggested, you've always talked about wanting to do movies or get into movies. Why don't we just do it? And then you founded your own, I believe, what was it, the Santa Barbara Community Film Studio? You
Right,
guys
right. Yeah,
won
it's
like a Best
exactly
Picture.
exactly right. Exactly an example of that. It was like that was after about a 2-year, maybe even a 3-year dry spell, and I felt like it was just all over for me. I couldn't get any work anywhere, traction. I'd be submitting things and nothing, and someone at a party mentioned they had this idea about a community. What if we did a community film studio based on the idea of community theater, but instead of doing little local musicals of Annie Get Your Gun, we would actually make a feature film. So I jumped onto that idea, and the two of us spent a year creating this thing. All amateurs. We advertised on Craigslist for actors. We put out a call for non-guild writers who had a script. They always wanted a low-budget script. They always wanted to turn into a movie. We got half a dozen sort of Hollywood refugees living in Santa Barbara, like myself, to head up the lighting department and the sound departments. And then whoever showed up and volunteered, they would get mentored into how to make a movie by the heads of these departments. And in the script, I helped the writer rewrite the script many, many times until finally it was into shooting shape. And then we made the movie. Made the whole movie for a feature film for $30,000. It cost another $30,000 for marketing and distribution, and it won Best Feature Film at the LA Femme Film Festival in 2013, I think. So it was a great experience.
What a great story of how to, because that rejection, you said, that dry spell, that could crush people as far as, and just feel, bring out imposter syndrome and everything.
Totally.
And
I think one of the things that helped me is that, I started writing little fictions when I was 9 years old. And for, probably 15, 20 years, I wrote short stories and short novels that no one ever saw, literally. I would write them and they would just sit there, and I never made any money. I never sent them anywhere. I never knew what to do with them. And it wasn't until I was, an adult human being that in fact, I know when it started. My career kind of started in college when I entered a short story into a college short story contest, and it didn't win. It took second place. So I got a little paper saying, you won second place in this short story contest. But one of the judges was friends with the fiction editor at Playboy. And unbeknownst to me, he sent my story into Playboy. And the first thing I knew about it was I got a check for $3,000 from Playboy magazine saying, we've accepted your story. I thought, what? Is this a scam? How did this happen? So that was the beginning of me thinking, I could actually make a living maybe doing this.
I would love to see the look on my wife's face if I just got a check for $3,000 from Playboy.
I know.
That's amazing. What an amazing story.
Yeah. I feel very lucky.
It would have been the opposite look on my face when I got a check from my university I'm in for grad school, and it said, here's a tuition reimbursement from an extra scholarship that you got. And I opened it up and it was 4 cents. It's a check I got recently. I was like, what? That's an incredible
there's
story.
a bar in at least there used to be a bar in LA called Residuals, where if you brought in a residual check for less than $1, you could have any drink in the house.
That's great.
I'm gonna have to see if there's a place like that around here. I'll bring it in and cash it out that way. That'll be my personal reward.
Yeah, they had all the checks taped to the back bar.
So you had a couple of quick hitters in your book about other films that maybe never got off the ground, or a series that was close, or a movie that was close. And I thought this one was crazy. About Dead Point was ready to shoot. You said it was
Yeah.
right there. If it weren't for, it had the lead actor Pierce Brosnan, was ready
Right.
to go, but it didn't happen because he ended up moving over to do a little something called James Bond right
Right.
afterwards.
Right.
That was fascinating. But as funny as that may be now, with James Bond obviously being such a big, what was that like having that? Was it seemed like in your writing that was the closest that it got to actually maybe making its way into the filming stage? What was that like to be so close and then feel like you had the rug pulled out from underneath you?
Yeah, it actually happened several times that I was that close,
Hmm.
and it always felt like the rug got pulled out. But it happened so many times that I kind of learned to anticipate that that's what was going to happen. That
Hmm.
happens so often to so many writers
Hmm.
and so many film productions that get almost to the end, to the finish line, and then something happens. I had this comedy horror film called The Transplant. It was also cast and in pre-production and ready to go, and then at the last minute there was this huge fight between the producer and the production company over money. You promised me I was going to give you this. No, no, no,
Mm.
we said we were going to give you this only if this happened. Fuck you. No, fuck you. I'm sorry if I can't say that. So
It's okay.
but things like that happen all the time. The funniest one
Mm.
for me, actually, that came so close was Shanghai, which is a movie about um, the experience of 20,000 Jews from Germany being rescued
Mm.
or sequestered in Shanghai during World War
Mhm.
II. And I was doing it. It was a co-Chinese government production, um, and going through what you had to go through with Chinese censors
Mm.
and political bureaucrats to keep
Wow.
changing the script over and over to satisfy them was
Mhm.
an exhausting experience. But I made it through all of that. And that also was like about to start shooting. In fact, they told me to show up at the Chinese embassy in 3 days to get a visa. They were going to send me on a
Wow.
press junket all around China because the movie was being cast and it was ready to get shot.
Mhm.
Everything was ready to go. And then the day before I was to get my visa, they emailed me and said, "Hold it, not so fast.
Wow.
Don't do anything until we call you back." And it turned
Mhm.
out that there were riots in Hong Kong that day,
Oh wow.
Mm.
political riots about not wanting to,
Mhm.
change their political system, and
Right.
riots had spread to Shanghai, but no one knew they had spread to Shanghai, and the Chinese did not want the world knowing they had spread to Shanghai. So the last thing they wanted was a Western film crew shooting there.
Right. No, that makes
Wow.
So so that one dissolved, and then I never heard from them again. I wrote them. I said, "What's the deal? Can we start up again? Riots are
Mhm.
over." Never heard.
Never heard back. Well, just like you had some quick hitters in your book, we have a few just rapid fire. These are a little random, a little fun. Some of them are more serious than other. Little quick hitters for you as we get
Okay.
going. You mentioned from the very beginning of the book how you went into other worlds to explore as a kid. So, rapid fire, favorite like science fiction or fantasy novel that you either grew up with or that you've come to love later on? Do you have one that you go back to?
Um, yeah, I loved The Moon is a Harsh Mistress. I loved 2001. I loved Stranger in a Strange Land. Um, I was a voluminous reader of science fiction short stories. They always
Mm.
had anthologies at the end of every year of, the best sci-fi of 1958. And I used to take those to the beach with me and read them. Our family would stay at a cabin on Lake Michigan every year for a month every summer, and I would just take boxes of sci-fi short stories with me. My
That
favorite one, I can actually, now
yeah.
that you say that, the favorite one that stands out, I can't remember who wrote it, but it was called "And Lo the Bird," as in "Lo the bird is on the wing,"
Mhm.
and the gag of the story was. Um, there's this like comet-like thing approaching Earth from a zillion miles away that some amateur astronomers have their eyes on. As it gets closer, they realize it's a gigantic planet-sized bird, and it flies past the Earth and it hovers over Mercury. And then Mercury hatches, and it turns out that the planets around the sun are actually eggs, and the sun is the incubator. And
That's fast.
Wow.
and so
That's
and
awesome.
then the bird goes to Venus, and now we know that the next one that's going to hatch is Earth.
That's fascinating. No, that's a good one. So Tom came up with this one. It was, which Disney Star Wars movie would you have most wanted to write the novelization of? If you could pick one of the either the 3 sequels or Rogue One, Solo, there's we had the 5 movies. If you had to pick one, which novelization would you have loved to write?
I think Rogue One finally. But
Mhm.
before this recent spate, before the reboot, I would have said The Empire Strikes Back because I thought that had more psychological beef in
Mhm.
it.
Mm,
But Rogue, I mean, Andor certainly, and Rogue One as well, just felt like there were more adults, more
Mhm.
possibilities for rich development of character and
mhm.
motivation.
You
Amazing.
mentioned, okay, I'm really excited for this one. So you mentioned alternative Star Wars ending that you had for Return of the Jedi. People go read the book, go buy his book, go buy the memoir, because you can see that alternative, the whole story about how you told George Lucas and never heard back. That was very funny. But you also had an alternative ending for Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, which you bring up.
Yeah.
Is there another alternative ending that you have for something that you love or something you're interested in that you did not mention in the book, that if you were to put pen to paper might have changed something a little bit?
An alternative ending for a book or movie that we all know, you mean? Or that I was
That we all
involved
know,
in?
or if it could be just something personal to you, even like if you have something that's more specific that we may not know of, is fine.
Yeah. I can't think of anything specific except, as I mentioned to you earlier, after I finished writing the memoir, I continued thinking of lots of stories that had happened to me, both
Mm,
in the movie world and in the medical world, and
mm.
that I would love to have put in. I don't think I have enough of them to actually write a whole another memoir, but I don't know, maybe as a magazine article someday.
We can do a double life part two. We can make it happen for sure. I would be a reader. Next one here. You're making the Death Star trench run. You're in your X-wing. You're in the cockpit. Who is your wingman? You have Wedge. Who is going to be your Wedge Antilles or Biggs Darklighter that's making the run with you?
Yeah, Cassian Andor for sure.
Okay, absolutely.
Good choice. Good choice.
And then last one, and I'll let Tom get in. Like, I know Tom probably has like a final question he wants to ask. But the last quick hitter here was, and we're not going to talk much Star Trek, but one Star Trek character from Voyager that you would put into Star Wars. You spend some time writing Voyager. If you could take one character from that show that you wrote on and put them into Star Wars, who would it be?
Yeah, I think it would be the Doctor hologram. I found he reminds me, his personality is reminiscent of K2's in a way. It's sort of
Mm,
there's an androidy like humor and naivete, but very pointed as well.
mhm.
Hmm.
I love Robert Picardo's portrayal of the Doctors. He's one of my favorite
Yeah.
actors in like a role of all time. There's a new Star Trek show coming out soon, like the Starfleet Academy that they've been doing, and he's reprising his role
Oh,
as the
great.
Doctor to show
Yeah.
up here and there. And my dad and I were, when I saw that, it's all caps, like the Doctor is back. So that's fantastic that you mentioned that. I love that.
Yeah.
Tom, any other like final like little quick hitter questions you wanted to
I,
ask?
I can mention in respect to that. Um, I mean, the one of the things that Star Trek did specifically was to take contemporary social
Mhm,
dilemmas and struggles and issues and put them into a science fiction story to make them, metaphorical but and palatable in some ways. And for me, because of my medical background, the doctor's stories always rang viscerally very true to
mm,
me. And the first one I did was called Critical Care, where they land on a planet where everyone on the planet is assigned a number according that represents their worth to the society. So a janitor has a lower number than a physicist, and everyone gets health benefits according to how high their number is. And that
wow.
felt like a really applicable kind of situation to where we are today in America.
And
Hmm.
it It makes sense too when you think about that. You would almost gravitate towards the Doctor as well, of course, being a doctor, but also thinking of his journey for in that show from being someone, very, very stern or even hesitant to become more than what he wanted to. You talk about like the hesitation for the hero to answer the call. In a lot of
Yeah,
ways,
yeah,
that
yeah,
character does too. And then ultimately comes
yeah.
into like the
Right.
ultimate form of himself as
And it
well.
speaks to the sort of the self-programming of AI and kind of where we're
Hmm.
headed now with, at what point does AI become
Hmm.
sentient?
Hmm. Absolutely. Any final, questions you want to throw at James here? What we have?
Real quick, I know we're running out of time, but you've worked with so many people and for so many people that I grew up with, heroes and just names that I know, some of the top people in film and in TV as well. But I want to segue into something else because I know you seem to be a jack of all trades with everything and master of some of them, or maybe all of them. You've made a mark in so many ways. And I just wanted to segue real quick and comment about your work actually as a songwriter,
Yeah,
composer. And I was listening to some of your music today. By the way, I took a walk this morning. Heard the song as a parent. I heard the song "Gone One Day," uh,
yeah,
and I I got really emotional as I'm
yeah,
taking my walk in the morning.
yeah,
Beautiful music. I was getting a lot of. I like the style. It was giving me like a James Taylor-ish
yeah,
vibe.
yeah, yeah.
And if you want to talk a little bit about your music and I guess where
Sure,
people could listen to it.
sure. I'd love people to listen to it. My music is actually, I've been focusing mostly on my music for the last, I don't know, 8 or 10 years. I mean, I've continued writing other things as well. I still have a spec series I want to try and sell, and I wrote a novel. But my music is closest to my heart at this point, and I feel like it's probably my best writing I've put into my music.
Hmm.
And there's a way in which heartfelt lyrics, along with certain kinds of spirit melodies really go right to your soul the way um, fiction or other forms of writing don't necessarily do. So
Hmm.
it's been a real uh, deepening kind of journey for me that I've really loved. And I love writing it. I think I've written a lot of beautiful things. The song you mentioned, I make myself cry every time I sing it. And in fact, I wrote that song. I don't think I used the story in the book, but I wrote that song for my daughter on her seventh birthday.
Oh,
Um, and I sang it to her on her seventh birthday, and it made her cry. And she made me promise never to sing it to her again because it made her too sad. So
it
it's,
that's great.
uh,
I actually for my daughters, I used to because video editing and making montages is one of the things that I love to do creatively. So for her birthday, now my both girls are in their 20s now, but all the way up to their 20th birthday is to make a video of all pictures from that year with a song, and that's
yeah.
definitely a song I would pick
Oh,
uh,
cool. That's
to
nice.
use.
My
Beautiful.
my my most recent album I did a couple years ago is called "By the Rising of the Sea," and it's an album of original sea shanties dealing with climate change and refugee problems, all and other things that climate change causes. Um, and it's I've always loved sea shanties. We never had a dishwasher when my kids were growing up because my wife wanted our kids to be the dishwashers. So we would stand in a row at the sink and sing sea shanties while we washed dishes together. So
That's
this
great.
was sort of the motivation for that. But I wanted to do something that had some social consciousness with it as
Mm,
well.
I
Awesome.
love that. Thank you so much for putting pen to paper and writing this memoir. I personally I love reading, different memoirs and stories from people that have just lived such almost like the fullness of the human experience in some way, because one thing that your book does that I think any great memoir that I've read or heard about does is you are like the perfect mixture of vulnerable and you go into depth. You don't really hold back in any of the stories that you put. You don't really pull a lot of punches, but you also still keep some things for yourself. Like there are not, like I don't feel like I know everything. And I love that too, because it feels like there is so much more like there that I would be fascinated to know about, and like that the book kind of draws you in a way where I can almost think of my own ways of how, ooh, how did the rest of that story play out, or
Yeah,
what went into those things. So I love the fact that I feel like you have lived this incredibly rich, life with all these stories. You were not afraid to hold back and put some of those vulnerable moments of your life in there, but it's also mixed in with the heart of some of the projects like Star Wars that you talked about. There's some funny stories in there. Like for those of you that buy this book, you should. The Poltergeist story of some of the poltergeisty things that you experienced while writing some of the
Yeah,
scenes
yeah,
that
yeah.
I was laughing and also getting freaked out at the same time while I was reading
Me
that.
too.
So I just want to thank you for being able to do that. And the last question we'll kind of leave with here is it's kind of a two-parter. One is, what is the thing that you want people to take away from the book when they finish reading or as they're reading? And where can they go buy this book? Like what's the best way for them maybe to make sure that they can get the word out about it as well?
Sure. I think if there's a message I want to send to people, it's don't hold back from pursuing your dreams. So often I and people I know, they want to do something, but the little devil inside says, "Oh, you can't do that. Don't even
Mhm.
bother trying to do that." And sometimes I listen to that little devil on Goofy's shoulder. But whenever I've been able to get past that and jump into something, even if it's scary, even if I don't think I can do it, even if I'm afraid people will laugh,
Mhm.
and sometimes I fail, it's still worth it because there are times when you don't fail.
Mhm.
And
Love that.
Great
in
advice.
terms of buying the book, the easiest way is Amazon. And can I just ask
Mhm.
all of your listeners, if you buy one, to please write me a review?
Mhm. Well, we'll definitely have a review out on Star Wars Newsnet for sure. You'll be able to listen to this interview in full there. Hopefully, we're recording this on a Tuesday, May 19th. Hopefully, we'll get this out in the next 24 hours, 36 hours, and then we'll get a full book review out as well. James, thank you so much for joining us today. Everyone, go buy James Kahn's memoir, A Double Life, a Jedi Memoir, A Double Life. It is out. Go get it. Write him a review, 5 stars. Tom,
And
any
check
final
it.
things before we sign off here?
I was gonna say, look him up on Spotify, Apple Music, wherever you get your music. You'll really enjoy. You really enjoy it. I definitely guarantee it.
Thanks so much. I appreciate
Fantastic.
you having me here.
Thanks, James. Appreciate it.
Thanks,
Wonderful
James.
conversation.
Great.
Everyone, remember, for light and life, we are all the Republic out there.